Few people could offer us better insight on Dorothy Day and her case for canonization than the two speakers I'm delighted to introduce to you today. Robert Ellsberg is editor-in-chief and publisher of Orbis Books, the publishing arm of the Maryknoll Fathers and Brothers, and a leader in religious publishing. At age 19, Ellsberg dropped out of college. I'm not suggesting that for others. Dropped out of college and went to work at the Catholic Worker House in New York City, alongside Dorothy Day for the last 5 years of her life. During those years, he became managing editor of the Catholic Worker newspaper, and like Day, he converted to Catholicism. After Dorothy Day's death, he edited her selected writings little by little by little, by little by little, by little and by little. Got it.
Is that the sequel?
No, the sequel is, more recently, The Duty of Duty, the Duty of Delight. I'm sick, I swear, this is why this is happening. The Duty of Delight, the Diaries of Dorothy Day, and her letters in All the Way to Heaven, the Selected Letters of Dorothy Day. He's also an author in other contexts. His books include All Saints, Daily Reflections on Saints, Prophets, and Witnesses for Our Time, The Saint's Guide to Happiness, Practical Lessons in the Life of the Spirit, and Blessed Among All Women, Reflections on Women Saints, Prophets, and Witnesses in Our Time. And not to let it stop there, he has a forthcoming book called Blessed Among Us, which is coming out this summer. Today he'll speak to us on Dorothy Day, and following that talk, he'll take a few questions, and we'll also hear from another Holy Cross alumnus, George Horton, of the class of 1967, who will speak to us on Dorothy's case for canonization. George is Director of Catholic Charities, Department of Social and Community Development for the Archdiocese of New York. He was the recipient of the 2013 Servant of Justice Award by the Round Table, a National Catholic Association of Diocesan Social Action Directors, in 2013. He contributes to the Archdiocesan newspaper Catholic New York and serves as a guest host for the Just Love radio program aired on the Catholic channel on Sirius Satellite Radio. George is working on Dorothy's case on behalf of the Archdiocese of New York and doing many of her interviews for the canonization process. So he'll talk a little about that. Dave O'Brien will moderate a little bit. And anyway, thank you, Robert, for coming, and I'm looking forward to hearing more.
Thank you very much. There, I took this off because I wanted to hear me sneeze. You hear me now? All right, it's good. I feel like a rock star. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, and especially to be invited by my old friend and one of my authors, David O'Brien, whom I've known for decades. I also am very honored to be here today with many people who have spent a lifetime in the Catholic Worker in the service of the ideals that Dorothy represented, and I am very humbled to be talking on this subject before them. I'm also aware, however, that there are probably lots of younger people, students here, who maybe are just learning about Dorothy Day for the first time, and it's a little difficult to speak for such a diverse audience. I didn't know exactly who would be here. You probably picked up kind of the themes of the books that I have written or edited. Dorothy Day and Saints have been my two kind of big interests, and they converge in the question of the canonization of Dorothy Day, which is something I've been very interested in. And that really is going to be more the focus of what I'm talking about today. I hadn't intended to give a kind of introductory overview of Dorothy Day, her life and spirituality, which I often do. But for the sake of those who are wondering exactly who she is, and if you came into the right place, I'll give just a quick little improvised synopsis of who we're talking about. Dorothy Day died in 1980 at the age of 83. She was born in Brooklyn. She grew up in California, Chicago, and in New York. She dropped out of college herself at a young age and moved to New York because she wanted to commit herself to the poor and the struggles for social justice. She worked on various radical newspapers, socialist, labor papers. She took part in anti-war demonstrations. This is all around 1916, 1918, that kind of period. Her friends were radicals, literary bohemians, anarchists, communists, that sort of thing. She was arrested a couple of times, the first time for protesting on behalf of women's suffrage in Washington, D.C. She went through some very difficult times in her life. She had a tragic love affair that resulted in an abortion. She had went through a time of wandering and questioning. There was something inside of her that a kind of yearning for the transcendent, though she didn't really have a name for that. She had not really grown up in a religious household, and she had rejected Christianity in her youth, thinking that the church seemed irrelevant to the social issues of her day. And then in the 1920s, she's living with a man she's really in love with in Staten Island. She gets pregnant. She's not married to him. And she undergoes this religious conversion. She decides that she wants to have her child baptized and that she will follow that herself, even though it means separating from the father of her child, because he did not believe in getting married. He was an anarchist and didn't believe in marriage. So she separates from him, raises the child on her own as a single mother, as a Catholic, and goes through this lonely period of searching for how she's going to connect her faith and her commitment to the poor and the oppressed. And in 1932, she's covering a march of the unemployed in Washington, D.C., and she goes and prays in the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception for some sign of how she can put these things together. And when she comes back home to New York, she finds a Frenchman there named Peter Morin, 20 years her senior. He was born in 1877, who'd been kind of tramping around as a kind of Franciscan troubadour in New York and around the East Coast, trying to find somebody who would help him put into motion this synthesis, this vision that he had for a lay Catholic movement that would live out the radical social teachings of the gospel. And Dorothy sees in him the answer to her prayers. And together they found a newspaper, The Catholic Worker, she called it, which then became this kind of seed of a community and a movement, which many of the fruit are in this room today. It started with what she called a house of hospitality in New York City, and that tradition continues there in New York and around the world, and here in Worcester itself, where they practice the works of mercy, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, living in voluntary poverty and community with those that they served, but combining that with a radical social critique of the system that produced so much poverty. This was, after all, 1933. It was the heart of the Depression, millions of people unemployed, looking for work. And she said the Catholic Worker was a newspaper for those, looking for work, out of work, hungry, who believed that perhaps, to show them that there were Catholics who were on their side. And the Catholic Worker kind of develops into a big thing, and a lot of people are attracted to this. The circulation of the paper expands. Before you know it, she's the leader of a lay Catholic movement. And then takes an even more radical turn later in the 1930s with the Spanish Civil War and then with World War II, when she connected this commitment to seeing Christ in our neighbor with the imperative not to kill our neighbor. And she takes a pacifist position, which is very, to say the least, unpopular. And she maintained that all through that time. And then after the war, with the dropping of the atomic bomb, when she was a prophetic figure in leading protests against preparations for nuclear war, and was arrested numerous times. And the Catholic Worker all this time was a sort of a marginal little operation. It had a sort of circulation, but on Catholic circles, considered kind of way out there somewhere. In the 1960s, with the kind of peace movement, and she becomes kind of the godmother of a rising kind of new generation of protest for peace and social justice. She was arrested at the age of 75 with the United Farm Workers in California. She opened a house for homeless women in her last years in New York City, and that's where she died in 1980 at the age of 83. That's sort of the story. That's the preamble to my talk, and I'll take it up from there. Dorothy Day has been called many things. After her death in 1980, our own David O'Brien, as I'm sure you know, many of you, called her the most important, interesting, and influential figure in the history of American Catholicism. Possibly in the whole corpus of your work, David, that's the line for which you will be best remembered. And if so, it's a good line. But it was an audacious claim in 1980, you have to admit. It's, after all, hard to measure the significance of a life at such close range. And yet it was amazingly prescient. 36 years later, it seems not just plausible, but indisputably true. There have obviously been many other interesting and influential American Catholics in the last 200 years. Founders of Catholic orders, educators, pioneers, charismatic bishops, writers, politicians, entertainers. But it would be hard to think of another American Catholic who so radically recalled the Church to its gospel origins and who exactly anticipated the course and the agenda that Pope Francis recently has outlined for the Church. In the platform he laid out before the 2012 conclave, Cardinal Bergoglio spoke of the need for the Church to step outside of itself, to go to the margins, to the peripheries, to touch the wounds of Christ. He has shown that that means a church that takes on the social structures of sin, that works for peace, for ecological wholeness, that embodies the spirit of mercy and reconciliation. That is the vision of church that Dorothy embodied. And in his address to Congress last year, Pope Francis went beyond even the encomium of David O'Brien, calling her not just the most important, interesting, influential figure in the history of American Catholicism. He included her in the ranks of Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr. as one of the four great Americans around whom he organized his remarks. In these times when social concerns are so important, he stated, I cannot fail to mention the servant of God, Dorothy Day, who founded the Catholic Worker Movement. Her social activism, her passion for justice and for the cause of the oppressed were inspired by the gospel, her faith, and the example of the saints. I was standing up and cheering when I heard this, but I can imagine maybe a little bit of head scratching in Congress and beyond. After all, the two Catholics he invoked, who, not by coincidence, close friends and associates, Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton, are hardly household names, even among contemporary Catholics. So, Thomas who? And why was the Pope invoking Doris Day? Students here don't even know that joke. Those in Congress who did recognize her name might have been aware that she'd been called many other things beside a great American, such as traitor, heretic, subversive, and of course communist. This never fazed her. I recall how amused she was to hear these words from J. Edgar Hoover, which I discovered in her declassified FBI file. It was my best J. Edgar Hoover voice. Dorothy Day is a very erratic and irresponsible person. She is engaged in activities which strongly suggest that she is consciously or unconsciously being used by communist groups. From past experience with her, it is obvious she maintains a very hostile and belligerent attitude toward the Bureau, that is to say the FBI, and makes every effort to castigate the FBI whenever she feels so inclined. I remember reading this aloud to her in her room in Mary House, and she laughed and said, "He makes me sound like a mean old woman." Read it again. When Dorothy's cause for canonization was endorsed by the U.S. bishops a few years ago, a state senator from Virginia wrote Pope Benedict to say he was revolted by the thought that a person of such loathsome character might be considered a saint. Welcome to Pope Francis, Senator. She took such criticism in stride. I was told of a time when she was speaking at a Catholic college, which may well have actually been Holy Cross, and the young man got up to denounce her as a communist, a traitor, a heretic, and a long list of other names. She listened patiently and said, "You neglected to mention that I was once arrested on a morals charge in Chicago." Which is true. On the other hand, even while she lived, there were those who called her a saint, and that was another matter. "Don't call me a saint," she was quoted as saying. "I don't want to be dismissed that easily." Now, when I say she was quoted, I may well mean quoted by me. I used this line in 1984 in the introduction to my edition of her selected writings, whatever it's called, though I have no recollection of the original source. And yet I'm frankly constantly surprised to discover that this is one line of Dorothy Day's which everyone is able somehow to quote. It's even the title of a documentary about her. And I have some regrets about this because it gives the impression that Dorothy was somehow cynical about the naming and veneration of saints, which couldn't be farther from the truth. What Dorothy opposed was being put on a pedestal, fitted to some preconceived model of holiness that would strip her of her humanity and at the same time blunt the radical edge of the gospel. After all, people might say, well, Dorothy Day, she can do such things, whether live in poverty or feed the hungry or go to jail for the cause of peace, because after all, Dorothy's a saint. The implication was that such actions, which would be unthinkable for normal people, must have come easily for her. But nothing came easily for Dorothy. As she said of her vocation, neither revolutions nor faith is won without keen suffering. For me, Christ was not to be bought for 30 pieces of silver, but with my heart's blood. And yet in 2000, Cardinal John O'Connor initiated the cause for her canonization, and with the approval of the Vatican for this cause, she was named a servant of God. Today, that process is advancing through the work of the Archdiocese of New York and the Dorothy Day Guild, which George Horton will describe later. And I've supported this cause, above all because I believe Dorothy embodied the type of holiness most necessary for our time, a holiness that is not concerned with its own purity, but empties itself to confront the burning issues of our time: poverty, violence, the desecration of nature, the meaning of work, the yearning for community, freedom, and peace. To be sure, as I've probably suggested, Dorothy's life departs in many ways from the usual mold of Catholic saints. As someone who had renounced Christianity in her youth, who spent her early life as a radical activist and journalist in the company of communists, anarchists, and literary bohemians, as someone who underwent an abortion in the aftermath of a failed love affair, and who subsequently bore a child out of wedlock. If she is named a saint, she will certainly be one with an unusual backstory. There are those who feel all this, and even more what happened after her conversion: her pacifism, her rejection of capitalism, her repeated arrests for acts of civil disobedience, her avowed anarchism. All that and more put her beyond the pale for canonization. But I'm more interested in a different kind of criticism, the criticism that has come from many deep admirers and followers of Dorothy Day, perhaps here today, who are nevertheless skeptical or suspicious of the canonization process. While it's not uncommon to question the worthiness of a candidate for canonization, as Ken Woodward noted many years ago, the question in this case is just the opposite. Is the process worthy of the candidate? There are those who feel that canonizing Dorothy Day would represent a co-optation of her message. It would shift attention from imitation to veneration, a preoccupation with miracles and so forth. It would cost money that could be spent on the poor. It would put too much emphasis on one person rather than the community she was part of. Inevitably, church officials would try to emphasize her wonderful work with the poor, her piety, her spirit of obedience, her respect for the magisterium, and perhaps filter out the problematic areas of her life and witness, particularly her radical pacifism and her prophetic resistance to the state. Coleman McCarthy, the journalist, is someone who has expressed this position with particular vigor. Writing in the National Catholic Reporter, he argued, "Putting a halo on Dorothy Day shows her no love. On the contrary," he says, "the American hierarchy's endorsement of this cause, quote, is little more than a self-serving gesture. The process of canonization," he argues, "is part of a sick process to defang Day's radical witness by putting her on a pedestal she would have rejected." These sentiments, shared by many people I know and admire, are not easily dismissed. But before addressing them, I'd like to begin by reflecting on what saints meant to Dorothy and what I think the process of saint-making means for the church. Simply put, it would be very hard to exaggerate the role that saints played in the life of Dorothy Day and the origins of the Catholic worker. Peter Morin told Dorothy that the best way to study Catholic history was through the saints, And it was by reading the lives of the saints that Dorothy first conceived the idea of initiating the Catholic worker. From the saints, she was inspired to begin with the means at hand, not waiting for any official approval. Constantly, she invoked the saints as patrons and intercessors, what she called picketing before St. Joseph when funds ran dry, calling on the assistance of the Blessed Mother in dealing with the problems in her CW family. The saints cropped up constantly in her speech and writing, almost as if they were personal acquaintances. She would speak always of the perfect joy of St. Francis, the exuberance of St. Teresa, who used to cheer up her sisters by dancing on the table with castanets, the mystical ardor of St. John of the Cross, who said, "Where there is no love, put love, and you will draw love out." In the early years of the Catholic worker, the newspaper was almost entirely illustrated by pictures of the saints, whether by Audie Bethune or later Fritz Eichenberg. Depicted in modern dress, engaged in the works of mercy, these figures literally illustrated what the editors were trying to communicate through words and actions. The saints, as Dorothy spoke of them, were our friends and companions, examples of the gospel in action. She devoted many years to writing a biography of her favorite saint, Thérèse of Lisieux, exulting in the incredible speed with which she was canonized, a sign that she was truly the people's saint. In discussing the saints, Dorothy always acknowledged their humanity, their capacity for discouragement and sorrow, their mistakes and failures, along with their courage and faithfulness. There is no doubt that she wished to take them off their pedestals, to show them as human beings who nevertheless represented in their time the ideals and spirit of the gospel. She was quite aware of the dangers of sentimental hagiography, what she called the pious pap that makes saints seem somehow less than fully human. She quoted a text about the eating habits of the saints, which read, "Blessed de Montfort sometimes shed tears and sobbed bitterly when sitting at table to eat." To this she commented, "No wonder no one wants to be a saint." She felt it was important that we tell the stories of, quote, saints as they really were, as they affected the lives of their times. But it was also important to understand their radical challenge, how St. Catherine of Siena challenged the Pope, how St. Benedict promoted a civilization of peace, how St. Francis met with the Sultan in a mission of reconciliation. When our friend Gordon Zahn, the great peacemaker, wrote about his discouragement with the bishops and their failures to address the Vietnam War, she wrote, "In all history, popes and bishops and father abbots seem to have been blind and power-loving and greedy. I never expected leadership from them. It is the saints that keep appearing all through history who keep things going." Above all, Dorothy believed that the canonized saints were those who reminded us that we are all called to holiness. She said, "We are all called to be saints. And we might as well get over our bourgeois fear of the name. We might also get used to recognizing the fact that there is some of the saint in all of us. Inasmuch as we are growing, putting off the old man and putting on Christ, there is some of the saint, the holy, the divine right there." In other words, for Dorothy, the task of being a Christian is a process of sanctification, a process of being conformed to the pattern of Christ. It was a process that was never completed because there was always more to be accomplished. So, not called to be canonized saints, but called to be saints. One of the things that attracted her to St. Therese was that in her little way, she showed a way of holiness available to all people and in all circumstances. From Therese, Dorothy learned that each sacrifice endured in love, each work of mercy, might increase the balance of love in the world. And she extended this principle to the social sphere. Each protest or witness for peace, though apparently foolish and ineffective, no more than a pebble in a pond, might send forth ripples that could transform the world. Her diaries make it clear how faithfully she applied this teaching in her everyday life. The daily efforts to be more patient, more forgiving, the little decisions to sacrifice her own time, privacy, and comfort for the sake of others. It was the practice of these small daily choices that equipped her for the extraordinary and heroic actions she performed on a wider stage. Well, if that's what saints meant for Dorothy, what is the meaning of saints for the church? It's important to recognize that in canonizing a saint, the church is not bestowing a kind of posthumous honor, like nomination to the Hall of Fame or something. Canonization does not benefit the saint. It is intended to benefit the church. Dorothy understood this. When a saint is canonized, it represents the church's solemn declaration that at least in the life of this servant of God, her message and witness, we may find a true and reliable guidepost for our own path of Christian discipleship. Through recognition of certain individuals, a very tiny number compared to all the saints, many of them known to God alone, the church enlarges our understanding of the gospel. It provides new models that people can relate to, examples who demonstrated the challenge of discipleship in their time and so challenge us to do the same in our own. Now, as Simone Weil said, it is not nearly enough to be a saint, but, quote, we must have the saintliness demanded by the present moment. Early in her life, Dorothy recognized the need for a new kind of saint. Even as a child, she noted how moved she was by the stories of saints who cared for the poor, the sick, the leper. But another question rose in her mind. Quote, where were the saints to change the social order, not just to minister to the slaves, but to do away with slavery? In effect, her vocation took root in that question. In 1932, in her faithful prayer at the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception, Dorothy sought an answer about how to integrate her faith and her commitment to justice and the cause of the oppressed. She prayed to make a synthesis of, quote, body and soul, this world and the next. In effect, she was in search of a model of how to minister to the slaves while doing away with slavery. Many saints had performed the works of mercy and poured themselves out in charity. Dorothy did the same, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, sheltering the homeless. And it's ironic to reflect that had she confined herself to this kind of work, her cause of sanctification might be much farther along by now. But she went further. She set herself, quote, against a social order which made so much charity in the present sense of the word necessary. In pursuing this path, she created a new model of discipleship, a new model of holiness, a new way of being a saint. Dorothy did more than anyone to win credibility for this path, and in so doing, she left an enormous gift to the church. For one thing, no one coming afterward would have to imagine what such a saint might look like. But there was more. The second great gift of Dorothy Day to the church was undoubtedly her commitment to the ideal of radical gospel nonviolence. This ideal was widely recognized in the early church, but after the conversion of Constantine, it was effectively replaced by just war teaching. For many years, in season and out, Dorothy was a solitary prophet insisting on the literal meaning of Jesus' words, love your enemies, do good to them that persecute you. No doubt her position was true folly in the eyes of the world. Her position was considered unreasonable, weak, dangerous, and irrelevant. We confess to being fools, she said, and we wish that we were more so. Now, in the early days, there were lots of people who applauded her work with the poor. And even in the heart of the Depression, there were also those who sympathized when she questioned the economic system that produced so much poverty and desperation. There were only a few who joined her in the conviction that the way of Jesus was incompatible with any kind of killing. And in 1955, when she was arrested in New York City during the city's first annual civil defense drill, the number of Catholics who agreed that such preparation for nuclear war was a crime against God and humanity could evidently fit beside her in a single police wagon. But for Day, it all went together. The Catholic worker was an effort to live out the radical implications of the teaching of Christ, that what we do to the least of our brothers and sisters, whether we feed them, torture them, or subject them to nuclear explosions, we do directly to him. By maintaining this witness through one war after another, Dorothy challenged and enlarged the conscience of the Church. Successive popes, culminating in Pope Francis, have grown steadily into the vision she upheld. But in the purity of that vision, she continues to stand ahead, beckoning the church to follow. All this might be enough, but I would like to cite another significant gift that Dorothy makes to the church. By far, the overwhelming majority of saints, both in history and in recent times, have been priests and members of religious orders. Of the 1,000 or so saints beatified or canonized under Pope John Paul II, the majority, apart from martyrs, have been founders of members of religious orders. Arguably, this helps reinforce a stereotype, reinforcing the notion that religious life is a prerequisite for holiness. As a layperson, as the founder and leader of a lay movement that has always operated without any official authorization from the church, as the publisher of a newspaper that presumed to take social positions far in advance of the magisterium of her time, Dorothy Day represents quite an unusual and highly significant candidate for canonization. Her whole life was founded on the conviction that none of us requires any special authorization or permission or mandate to live out the implications of the gospel, to follow Jesus. But another point deserves emphasis here. When the church does occasionally canonize lay people, these are often men or women who in their life experience and spirituality were virtually indistinguishable from monks or nuns. In Dorothy Day, we have a saint who truly experienced the joys and sorrows of family life, of motherhood, and life in a somewhat raucous and mixed community. This is a saint whose conversion was prompted by the experience of pregnancy and the joy of love. She wrote, "I had known enough of love to know that a good, healthy family life was as near to heaven as one could get in this life. There was another sample of heaven, of the enjoyment of God. The very sexual act itself was used again and again in Scripture as a figure of the beatific vision. It was not because I was tired of sex, satiated, or disillusioned that I turned to God. Radical friends used to insinuate this. It was because through a whole love, both physical and spiritual, I came to know God." Here too she represented that synthesis between body and soul, a fully human, embodied form of spirituality and being in the world. Her contribution to the apostolate of the laity is another way in which she exemplified a kind of saintliness demanded by the present moment. Still, there's worry that canonizing Dorothy Day, the church will try to water her down, or as Coleman put it, defang her radical message. Why canonize her? Why not just let her remain a people saint? There are inevitably symbolic, if you will, political considerations associated with certain canonizations. There is always the question, what lesson or message does the church wish to impart through this canonization? The recent, though belated, recognition of Oscar Romero as a genuine martyr and not just a pious churchman is a significant example. In naming Archbishop Romero a martyr who died in hatred of the faith, the church acknowledges that he did not die for getting himself mixed up in politics, as his ecclesial critics charged, but because he faithfully followed the gospel. Perhaps it is meaningful that this pronouncement awaited the pontificate of Pope Francis. In this context, Romero walks ahead, beckoning us to fulfill the Pope's vision of a church that is poor and for the poor. By the same token, I believe this particular ecclesial season provides a very special context for promoting the canonization of Dorothy Day. Pope Francis, it seems to me, is the fulfillment of Dorothy's dream. If she had let her imagination run free, she might have conceived of a pope who took the name of from St. Francis, who set out to renew the church in the image of Jesus, promoting the centrality of mercy, reconciliation, peace, and solidarity with those on the margins. So often she criticized ecclesial trappings of power and privilege. How she would have delighted in Francis's gestures of humility, his call for shepherds who have the smell of the sheep, his washing the feet of prisoners, including women and Muslims, his tears on the island of Lampedusa as he contemplated the deaths of nameless immigrants and lambasted the culture of indifference. How moved she would be to learn of his deep friendship with a Jewish rabbi, his love for opera and Dostoevsky, and his exhortation to spread the joy of the gospel. It has been said that the new atmosphere under Pope Francis has put wind in the sails of Dorothy's canonization, but I would rather put it in another way. I think the cause of Dorothy's canonization helps put wind in the sails of the Pope's agenda. Support for her cause in this context means more than keeping her memory alive. It contributes to the ongoing program of renewal of the Church, not for its own sake, but for the sake of a wounded world. What are the concerns that canonization will cause her witness to be watered down and homogenized? In the end, I would argue that canonization is actually the best insurance that the distinctive features of her holiness will be remembered, not just in our time and in the next few years, but long from now in the future. Just as the beatification of Franz Jägerstatter was an Austrian peasant who was the single layperson executed by the Nazis in Austria for refusing to serve in Hitler's army and take an oath of obedience to the Führer. I believe the beatification of Franz Jägerstatter lifts up the memory of his solitary witness. So I believe the canonization process for Dorothy Day will spread the story of her going to jail to protest civil defense drills and the blasphemy of preparations for nuclear war. It will move her witness from the margins to the center of the Church's memory. Of course, it commonly happens that prophets and radicals are ostracized in life only to be honored after death. It was thus for St. Francis, the patron saint of bird baths. Martin Luther King is widely lauded for his dream of a post-racial America, but not for his radical criticism of militarism and capitalism. Dorothy Day is hardly exempt from this danger. Even as she lived, she had to confront pious legend-making. She upbraided Catherine de Hewitt Doherty for promoting the myth that she shared her bed with a syphilitic homeless woman. Dorothy retorted, "I can't even sleep with my daughter. She wiggles too much." She was exasperated with people who asked her if she had the stigmata or if she had visions. "Just visions of dirty dishes and unpaid bills," she said. Some people will always prefer the myth. The answer, I think, is not to reject her canonization, but to assume the task of proclaiming her story with all its radical edges, making sure that nothing of her humanity is discarded. But finally, didn't Dorothy say, "Don't call me a saint, I don't want to be dismissed so easily"? Of course, a real saint could hardly have said otherwise. Try to picture that in a different answer. By all means, call me a saint. Say it again. I like the sound of that. St. Francis said that God had chosen him because of all creatures he was the most miserable. Pope Francis, asked to describe himself, said, "I am a sinner whom the Lord has looked upon." But in Dorothy's case, this was more than a matter of humility. Dorothy did indeed worry that people would put her on a pedestal, that they would believe her to be without faults, that they would imagine that if she performed seemingly difficult things, it was because they were not really difficult for her, she, after all, being a saint. This was a way for people to dismiss her witness and let themselves off the hook. And she didn't believe she was better than other people. She didn't believe people should set out to imitate her. They should look to Christ as their model. All Christians were called to put off the old person and put on Christ, to conform their lives to the pattern of the gospel, to respond to their own call to holiness, whatever form that might take. I once heard her say, when they call you a saint, it means basically that you're not to be taken seriously. But when Dorothy used the word saint, she certainly wasn't indicating someone to be dismissed easily. On the contrary, a saint was someone to be taken with the utmost seriousness. We may stand aloof from her canonization on the grounds that she is too good for this process. But if we do, I wonder if it isn't we who are the ones putting her on a pedestal she would have disdained. Certainly she challenged the church in its capacity for failure and corruption. The church, she liked to say, quoting Guardini, is the cross on which Christ was crucified. But for her, the church was also the mystical body of Christ, of which she was also a part. She had enough knowledge of her own sins and failings to include herself among all those called to penance and conversion. The story of Dorothy is becoming better known around the world. In the Church of the United States, she's undoubtedly more widely known and respected than at any time since her death, or even in her life. But ultimately, the question of her canonization is not about drawing greater attention to her, but whether through her witness, more attention will be drawn to Jesus and his message of radical love. I'd like to conclude by returning again to Pope Francis's words to Congress last year. The speech he organized with reference to 4 great Americans: Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., Dorothy Day, and Thomas Merton. Naturally, Dorothy would be humbled by such attention. I don't know if she'd say, "Don't call me a great American. I don't want to be dismissed that easily." Not only to be mentioned by the Pope, but in the company of national icons such as Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King, she would have appreciated this ecumenical assembly. Only she and her friend Thomas Merton were Catholics, and both of them were prophetic figures who were also pushing toward the margins. Of these 4, only Dorothy is a candidate for canonization. But I think the Pope's words invite us to think anew about the meaning of saints, witnesses, and other great souls. Such men and women, according to the Pope, quote, offer us a new way of seeing and interpreting reality. We're accustomed to thinking of saints as people who stand out for their heroic faith and their witness to the gospel values. Perhaps we are indeed inclined to put them on a pedestal, to imagine that we could never do what they did. But before their bold and courageous actions, perhaps what distinguished such people was their way of seeing and interpreting reality. They looked at the world through a gospel lens, and in doing so, saw things according to a new scale of value. What would it mean if we saw in the poor and homeless, as Dorothy Day did, the face of Christ? We might not immediately open our homes, as she did at the Catholic Worker, but perhaps we would not be so susceptible to what Pope Francis calls the culture of indifference. What would it mean if we shared the vision of Thomas Merton when he ventured into downtown Louisville after years as a Trappist monk and was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that he loved all the people on the street? Quote, that they were mine and I theirs, that we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. In the 4 Americans he extolled, Pope Francis also focused on the power of their dreams. Quote, for Lincoln, liberty. Martin Luther King Jr., liberty and plurality and non-exclusion. Dorothy Day, social justice and the rights of persons. And Thomas Merton, the capacity for dialogue and openness to God. Along with their role of helping us to see and interpret reality in a new way, perhaps we might consider how such men and women invite us to share their dreams. Rather than disconnecting us from reality, such dreams actually awaken us from illusions of separateness, from the slumber of indifference, from false conceptions of greatness that prevent us from seeing just how much we are all connected. It is by the greatness of its dreams, according to the Pope, that a people is measured. The same is true for the people of God. Those who help us to see and to enlarge our dreams may not always meet the bar of official canonization, but in honoring their memory, as Pope Francis observed, quote, we are inspired even amid conflicts and in the here and now of each day to draw upon our deepest cultural reserves. Thank you very much. Let me first, back up a little bit. If she's not canonized, does that mean that her spirit runs free and we can all start Catholic worker houses without asking permission from the church? Because, in fact, her canonization won't impact that in any way. People will still be able to pursue her vision and even go beyond it, but drawing inspiration from the same sources that inspired her. So I don't see. Again, we're talking about not the next. We're talking about, let's say, 100 years from now. What is going to make it more likely that people are going to know about her story, her witness? I think of someone like, Franz Jägerstätter, for instance, who died all alone in 1942, maybe, I'm not sure, 44, in Austria. He died without any expectation that anyone would ever know of his witness. He didn't do it in order that he might be a statue in a church someday, but because he was following his conscience and he couldn't do otherwise. And it was because of our friend Gordon Zahn, who wrote a biography of him many years later in the 60s, that his story became known. And many years later, he's beatified by the church. I think an extraordinary, it's a person like that, for me, rather than being hemmed in and squeezed in by this oppressive institution, actually carves out an opening and a space for other people to operate in, to be able to claim the full authority of the gospel and now also the church. Now, your second question, what would she think of it? Happily, I think I think she would ask in the same way when she was getting old and people said, well, what's going to happen to the Catholic worker after you die? And she said, doesn't matter. It was not her problem. That's for the young people, as she would call them. That's for the next generation. Not necessarily, she didn't establish a kind of a foundation to support the Catholic worker indefinitely. She and Peter Moran put out their ideas. They planted seeds. And she left the freedom of people to plant those and let them blossom in any way they might. But she knew it was out of her hands, and she didn't try to control that in any way. She didn't name her successor or anything like that. I think, if you asked her while she was alive, would you like to be a saint someday? Well, that's again a meaningless thing. Her whole ambition in her whole life was to be a saint, and whether that was recognized through canonization was not up to her and not her concern. And I think in the same way, she recognized, as I've tried to suggest, the value and the role that saints play. And again, not to call attention to them or preserve their memory, but to help people live out more authentically the challenge of the gospel. If this process, when she had respect for the church, she was not cynical about the church in that way. She knew it had its processes, its corruption. I think she'd be very glad in a way that it waited decades and that it was not some, santo subito, after she died, a rush of enthusiasm, but that the church in some ways would catch up with. I think it's a sign of how much the church has grown into her vision, and I hope that her canonization, my hope would be that it would be one of the forces that would help that process of growth and renewal in the church. Now, I want to say again that people that I love and know and respect disagree with me about this, and I recognize them as people who have every bit as much claim or more in many cases to their loyalty and faithfulness in living out Dorothy's vision. So, I'm speaking for myself here of why I think it's nevertheless still valuable.
One more, and then we'll ask George. I'm slightly different tack. Thank you for coming. It was a really well-presented talk. It's a beautiful environment, too. I'm curious about the emotional tones and experience of her life in the last few years of her life. I was always struck by a sense of an undercurrent of depression or unfulfillment of one form or another. The title of her autobiography, The Long Loneliness. And I'm just curious, in what ways, knowing her well, in what ways would you say she was very satisfied with the work she'd done? And in what ways she might have experienced some emotional loss or deprivation or stuntification because of the sacrifices and choices she made?
Dorothy's vocation was rooted in sacrifice from the very beginning. Her choice that she would be baptized and raise her child as a Catholic, even though that meant separation from the man she loved. It was only when I edited her letters and saw the 5 years of love letters that she wrote to Forster after that time, pleading with him to change his mind and give up his pig-headedness and agree to marry her, that I realized what a sacrifice that was. On the other hand, it revealed to me a lot about her spirituality and her, which was she felt that she had paid a price for her faith. As she said, it didn't come easily. It was, she had given, in a way, everything. And I think she felt in many ways, as the gospel texts say, those who've given up home and family and all this kind of thing will be given back abundantly, 1,000-fold. I think, she had this one daughter. I think that she felt, by the end of her life, that she had thousands of children. Now, she also had to come to, very early to the idea that to incorporate the idea that weakness, vulnerability, seeming failure in the eyes of the world was actually the kind of fuel of the Catholic worker enterprise. So she did not measure the success or the meaning of her life by whether they had enough money to pay the bills or whether she had put an end to war or that sort of thing. She believed utterly in the idea that faithfulness was the only thing in our control. We had no control whatsoever in the outcome. And if she had felt otherwise, I think she would have felt fantastically depressed. Of course, she had to deal with fights and arguments in the worker and people, laying into her and betraying her and being mad at her and leaving and all kinds of stuff like that. So she experienced all kinds of human loss and frustration. But she, I think, never had a moment of doubting that she was on the path that God had set her on and that she was faithful to that, to the end. So, yes, I would say that, when she was, they put on her gravestone, not like, phew, it's all, his long loneliness is over, but her motto, on her gravestone is Deo gratias, thanks to God. I think that she was one of the most grateful people I've ever known, and she had this capacity for just acknowledging grace in all different kinds of ways. And she had her moments of depression, she had her moments of dejection. But then she would say, but then on the other hand, just the sight of some kind of love or generosity or sharing, or when brothers and sisters, break bread together or whatever, or pray together, her spirit would be renewed. It took very little to bring her back. It might even just be listening to the opera, reading a favorite book, looking at one of her grandchildren, looking at a trumpet vine growing on the fire escape outside her. All these things could bring her back to God. So in that sense, never far from God, and in that sense, never could feel alone or a failure.
We'll let Robert sit for a moment and ask George Horton of the class of 1967 to come forward. George can tell us a little bit about the canonization process, and then we'll open up for questions for both of them. Thank you, George.
Thank you, David. It's good to be back here at Holy Cross, and it's good to be here with Robert Ellsberg. Robert's been a member of our Dorothy Day Guild Advisory Board for many years, and as you can see, his brilliant defense and discussion of Dorothy as a saint is very powerful. As he was speaking, I wanted to say to Robert, you have the easy part. Dorothy Day is a saint, and you make the arguments for her. We have to deal with the canonical process in the diocese. So I want you all to begin to feel very badly for me. David O'Brien. David and I both grew up in the same town, Pittsfield, Massachusetts. We went to the same high school. David's been a leading light to people like myself who have been doing justice and peace work in diocese. And after today, and listening to the workers talk, the only regret I have, David, is that I wasn't here when you were teaching. It's so good for me to see Holy Cross honoring justice and peace. When I was here, it was that way too, except my best memory is of Monday mornings when the line from confession would stretch from the chapel all the way to Fenwick. And the line, after the weekend, would only be in front of one confessional. And that was, do you know? It's how long it is. I heard someone, Father Hart, at your gymnasium. He was a one Hail Mary person. And even though the chapel, all of the confessional boxes were open, only Father Hart had the line that stretched out. And just let me say one other thing about this morning. We spent the day talking about the Catholic worker in Worcester, and it was an amazing experience. I felt awe in the presence of the people there, the stories, the commitment to the faith, to poverty, to people who are poor, to peace, all of the aspects we know of Dorothy Day. And at one moment, someone talked about the contemporaneity of Jesus. And there was kind of an agreement in the room that it still continues. I want to thank the workers. It was marvelous this morning for the richness of that experience. Let me touch on three things. One, a little bit of the history of the canonization process. Some of the obstacles/challenges we faced, and then with a little bit of a discussion of what's going on now. First of all, a little bit of the history. Shortly after her death in 1980, people began to speak about her being canonized and being a saint. The Claretians in Chicago began a movement. They developed a prayer card, began gathering documents. Then in the late 90s, Cardinal John O'Connor, who was the Archbishop of New York, began to explore a formal initiation of her cause. And Cardinal O'Connor had a wonderful way of listening to people. So what he did was convene a meeting of people who knew Dorothy very well. And some of the names are in the Hall of Fame. They're Nina Polson Moore, Frank Donovan, Janie Salmon, Ade Batoon, Eileen Egan. Robert was there, Pat and Kathleen Jordan, Tom Cornell. And we met for 2 hours twice. And his question to them was, should we go ahead in the church to make her a saint? 2 things happened in that meeting. One, it was almost unanimous to go ahead. There were a couple reservations expressed. One had to do with the cost. Should we spend all this money on a canonization process when it could be spent on the poor? And that discussion kind of moved along. And the second concern, how will the true story be kept? This is the question of the young man earlier today. I am a bureaucrat. I work for Catholic Charities. I was asked to do this because our office is involved in social action, but the people from the worker were new to me. I had convened them and brought them together. And as I sat in that room, something happened. I felt the Spirit move through that room in a way I had never felt before. We have an august cardinal over here and the workers here. And in our divided times, there was a communion, a community in that room. I walked out so grateful for that opportunity. I'm going to tell you a little story about something that happened that day that I think captures some of the maybe difficulties we have experienced with the canonization process. Through Cardinal O'Connor's efforts, shortly before he died, she was named a servant of God in the year 2000. Monsignor Gregory Mustachulo, who was Cardinal O'Connor's secretary and is now the Vicar General of the Archdiocese, was appointed postulator. In 2005, a guild was established, which is necessary to demonstrate grassroots support for the cause. There's a website, dorothydayguild.org. My wife, Carolyn, who is here, oversees the website and produces the newsletter. And we have a Mass in St. Patrick's Cathedral monthly to pray for her cause. I'd ask you before you leave to pick up some documents on the table in the back so that you might become a member of the Guild. We also have a prayer card there. And a petition. I'm glad Carolyn came along. And in November 2012, as Robert mentioned, the current Archbishop Timothy Dolan received the unanimous support of the U.S. bishops for the cause. I want to discuss just a little bit what I consider to be a loss of momentum that we've had or did have after the death of Cardinal O'Connor. And in this way, kind of demonstrate some of the challenges. As I mentioned to you before, the cost of this. The number that is batted around is $1 million. We just didn't have it. If you think about some saints, they have the backing of a religious order, so they're able to bring resources together for developing the cause for that. The people who knew Dorothy, by and large, did not have deep pockets. So by and large, we were not looking to a place to bring in resources. Second, as we've mentioned, who's going to tell the story? How will her story be kept? One of the things I think we've done well is to have an advisory board that was made up of many of the people that were with Cardinal O'Connor at those initial meetings and continue, in my view, to have a major role in how this cause progresses. But there has been some conflict, some creative tension, and I think that there are many reasons why we may have lost momentum. One of them, I think, is the Archdiocese. We dropped the ball for a while. But there was an undercurrent of tension, of conflict in the church. And even though it wasn't spoken of, it was there. And the story that I want to tell you quickly is a story that happened at that meeting with Cardinal O'Connor that, in my mind, embodied some of the tensions, and I would say creative, dynamic tension that we need today was in that room. Cardinal O'Connor was a great churchman. I don't know if many people knew him. He cared about the poor. He cared about working people. He defended life. And he believed in Dorothy Day. And at this meeting, he was waiting for all the people that I mentioned, Eileen Egan, Adi Bethune, to come in. And I'm the young bureaucrat thinking, boy, I hope this meeting goes well. Cardinal O'Connor had a way of kind of lolling, kind of like a prince of the church. And he was kind of lolling that way, and people were coming in, and again, the warmth of people in the worker, greeting each other. And all of a sudden, Adi Bethune appears at the door. And Cardinal O'Connor says, Adi, do you still have your coffin in your house? Now, he had known Adi from Newport. He had been the chief of naval chaplains. He was an admiral. He'd been in Vietnam in two tours. He had written a book about Vietnam. But he had become friends with her in Newport. This little woman, who you knew when she walked in the room that she packed tremendous power, raised her finger and said, John O'Connor, you've come a long way. You were an awful hawk. And that's how the meeting began. And I thought, well, it's got to go uphill from here. But in fact, Adi had seen some movement in this prelate. He had been one of the writers of the 1983 Challenge for Peace. And he did other things for peace that I knew about. But that moment typified to me the tensions in our church, but also the fact that we can have relationship, right relationship, and respect each other's thinking. These were two different worlds, but in that moment, there was something precious which took place. And I say that needs, in a sense, to be continued. Robert says that Pope Francis needs Dorothy. The church needs Dorothy. So, just let me mention a few things that I think helped us gain momentum. Again, there was that undercurrent of people not too sure, the worker not too sure, the archdiocese not too sure. And 3 or 4 years ago, there was a conference in Miami at St. Thomas in which many of you were there in a gathering, and the question was asked, what's happening with the cause? That gave us a great impetus, and particularly a man named David Mueller was very helpful in that. Robert's article, and I would urge you to find the Catholic Worker article. Do you remember the date, Robert?
It's online.
It's online, in which he makes the case for her canonization. And it was made for the people of the worker. It was written for them. It generated a lot of discussion, but has been critical in getting the momentum going again. The diocese put some money into this, which is a big thing. We're finally able, during all those years, we had no staff, really. It was Catholic Charities staff, myself and another person who were trying to pick this up. We hired Jeff Corrigan, who is a part-time worker for the staff, on the staff. And again, the coming of Pope Francis hasn't hurt. It's created an atmosphere which I think allows us to sail along better. I often think, he's an elderly man, and we better move quickly, or we better hurry up. So then, let me say a little bit about where we are today. One way of understanding the canonization process, and I'm not a canon lawyer, is there's a Roman phase and a diocesan phase. We're deeply into the diocesan phase. Within the next 9 months, we hope to interview 50 witnesses to Dorothy Day's life. Some people who knew her very well, some who knew her in passing. but we're going to get testimony with the promoter of justice and the Archbishop's delegate and transcribers and seals and all of those things. We will have 50 testimonies which will be ready to be sent to Rome. We're gathering all her documents, and we could say to Dorothy, you could have made it a little easier with your published writings and your unpublished writings. We're gathering those. They have to be reviewed by a theological censors and also a historical commission. We hope to do that within the next 2 years. That's our hope, to get all of that done, signed, sealed, and delivered to Rome. Then we will have to face the Roman phase. I don't know if you saw recently, but the Holy Father, Pope Francis, has kind of raised some questions about the cost of the canonization process, and I think there is, we have some hope. Many of the major expenses were in Rome, as you might imagine. So we're hoping that might help a little bit. Again, we hope to have this done in 2 years, the process. Let me conclude with something that just happened last weekend. And I want to, again, to me, it's how the church needs Dorothy. There are many reasons for her to be canonized, but to me, this is one that's close to my heart. On Friday night, I went down to the Catholic Worker. Martha Hennessy, Dorothy Day's granddaughter, is on our advisory board and has been very helpful in promoting the cause. And she had brought a priest from Korea, an activist priest, who had spent his life in and out of jail in South Korea, protesting human rights in Korea, and the U.S. military presence in Korea, on Jeju Island, where the United States has just created a very large naval base. So she brought the priest in, and it was a wonderful evening, a typical Catholic Worker evening. We walked into the Worker. The Worker hasn't changed very much, although the neighborhood has. There's a coffee bean, high-end coffee shop at the end of the street. But the clarification of thought that took place that night, and in the middle of it, 15 young women from Loyola in Chicago, walked in and sat down in the front row to listen to this. And I think of being at Holy Cross today, how important it is that we speak. Again, I don't know how many Americans are aware of the base at Jeju. And here was a full discussion of our military presence. The next day, Martha, Father Mun, who was the Korean priest, and a couple other Catholic workers came to the cathedral for Mass. And it doesn't take much to be struck by the difference in these two venues. St. Patrick's Cathedral has just been renovated to the tune of about, should I say, $160 million. It's beautiful. It's gorgeous. When Father Mun came in, I said to him, well, Father, this is the South Korean priest, you know that St. Patrick's has been renovated. And he said, I see. It was just two different worlds. But there we were at the Worker Friday night, St. Patrick's Cathedral on Saturday morning. And to me, that is part of the tension. That's part of what we need to have relationship and to have right relationship, respectfully caring about each other, but listening to the message of Dorothy Day. We need her. She's a saint for our time, and we got to do all we can to accomplish that. Thank you.
Two things come to mind. One is, it seems to me that John Cardinal O'Connor was particularly appropriate to introduce the cause of Dorothy Day, because not only had he played an instrumental role at the Vatican Council in promoting the ban on weapons of mass destruction and recognizing the right of conscientious objectors, but by the time he called that meeting, he had, according to him, become a pacifist and said, I don't know why I never saw it. This was after being a military chaplain in between. The second thought is, I think it's important, this is something that has come to me slowly, but I think it's important to realize Dorothy was relentless. And when forced to refuse to marry her, she didn't just give up and say, well, now I'm a martyr and I'm going to live it out for the rest of my life. I was at Tivoli between 1972 and 1977. She died in 1980, and she was stationed at Tivoli during that period. And I only realized it in retrospect, but a great deal of her energy was going to family. She was regularly visiting her granddaughter and grandchildren, but she was also weekly visiting Foster Batterham, the man she had been in love with. And as I understand it, by the time that she died, she was sequestered at Mary House, having had some major heart attacks, and he was visiting her there and watching television with her and their daughter, Tamar. And I saw him at the wake after her death. He was a little shrunken little man, as I remember him. And I am told that the next day at her funeral, I should say this before I tell you this last thing. She has said to me, I believe that he will come to the faith one day. And at her funeral, I am told, he received communion. What that signified for him, I don't know. But to me, it signifies that Dorothy got her man. This is one of the great stories of reconciliation. Yes, Jim.
The question maybe for you, Ross, is, when this process, they have to go through all these documents, and the incredible amount of writing, the journals and letters, is there anything that the process has the potential to find in there in terms of, that could derail the process?
Well, I was interested to hear that that's going to take a couple of years. I've read all that stuff, though actually I probably spent more years than that doing it. Aside from all of her published writings, which I've read, and then I was invited to be the editor of her diaries and letters. Now, I read all the letters that are available, and that's a very small percentage of all the letters that she wrote. She probably wrote, thousands of letters a year. She spent probably, it was a big surprise to me that with all the Catholic worker and with all the protests and all that kind of, probably if you added it up, what did Dorothy spend her life doing? It was writing letters, probably hours every day. She'd write in her diary for maybe just a few minutes, but hours writing letters. So those are all over the place. I was able to just work with the letters that people had kept or preserved, donated to the Catholic Worker Archives. I never, really worried that I might come across something and say, "Oh my God, maybe I'll lose this letter," or something like that. Same thing with her diaries. They're very frank. They're not dealing with theological issues. They're dealing with what's in her heart, and she's very honest about her failings, about her own, sins. I mean, she really practiced kind of an examination of conscience, of really reviewing all the ways that she'd hurt people during the day and tried to make up for it and pray for a better temperament and that sort of thing. So I think that for me, it was a deeply moving experience to see that other side of her that I'd never really known, the private side, where she was just writing for God alone or for individual friends. As for her books, they've been around. It's not like these have been gathering dust somewhere. They've been in print for 50 years or whatever. They're being reprinted. All of her writings in the Catholic Worker are an open book. At one point early on, the Archdiocese suggested that she have a censor who would be available to her, and she agreed with that. She didn't mind having a priest who would look over her shoulder. She was a convert. She had no theological education. She didn't mind being corrected if she made some gaffe, but she made it very clear. My writings about social justice, about capitalism, about the poor, about labor, about peace, that's none of his business. And the church never intervened or overruled her on that. And eventually, I don't know what happened to the censor. He kind of drifted away. But so no, I think that certainly, in the 1950s and the 1960s and more recent times, there would be many, depending on who you gave it, read this stuff. Plenty of things that a Catholic theologian might have said, "My gosh, this is terrible stuff." Here's an interesting story that's little known. in World War II, I only discovered this recently. World War II, an FBI, someone from the Justice Department writes to Archbishop Cardinal Spellman and says, Dorothy Day is writing all this kind of pacifist stuff. Is this really kosher? You know, he didn't say that word, but is this really okay Catholic stuff? You know, is she a Catholic in good standing? And he appointed this Jesuit who taught in the seminary, a moral theologian, to go over it and come up with a response. And he came up with this argument that said, yes, what she's saying is not common, it's out of the mainstream, but it has a very dignified and authentic, you know, place within the Catholic tradition. That was good enough for Spellman. He passed that on, said she's okay, even though they couldn't have disagreed more on that subject. So I think that, in fact, anybody looking back on her, rather than saying, oh my gosh, she was way outside the norm, they'll say, on all these subjects, ecumenism, the rights of conscience, in opposing anti-Semitism, and option for the poor, and ecology, and solidarity, and in liturgical renewal, and reading the Bible, and all these kinds of ways, the apostolate of the laity, she was so far ahead of all the others. And the church is just catching up with her now. So, you know, I'm not too worried. I think she'll get a passing grade.
I'm just going to say, first of all, thank you very much for your talk. But it seemed, and you sort of answered my question, which is, it seems to me that anybody, you know, there were 1,000 people canonized during John Paul II's. Probably not one of them left a written record close to what she's written. And it seems to me that the fear that maybe initially people in the Catholic worker community had that she'd be put up in a pedestal in the wrong sense. No one who's left a written record like she has could possibly be put on a pedestal in any sense, if that is to say, of not being really human. That's one sense. And another sense, whose radical message about society, about our economic system, about our militarism. So I guess that what that says to me is there's a special, the burden going forward for the next decades and century or so, or whenever, for the future, is on Catholic publishers and educators to make sure that her whole message sort of stays out there. And that we don't try to shrink it, like in some ways Martin Luther King's message. We don't hear about the Riverside Church sermon that Martin Luther King gave in 1967 against the war. You know what I'm saying? We hear about the I Have a Dream speech. And so that's the kind of challenge that Catholic publishers and Catholic educators have.
I've done my little part.
Well, I was at the gathering today with all of the Catholic workers, and I think for me, as a woman who grew up in the 50s and went to an all-girls Catholic high school and was a product of Catholic education, Dorothy Day represents, although she never called herself a feminist, for me, an advancement in consciousness for women in the church. And although she never really said anything about women's ordination and being for it or against it, I know that in 1976, an incredible document was signed by many women theologians that Paul Keeney, sitting here, gave to me in the 80s, saying that nothing existed scripturally, speaking on behalf of all the scripture scholars, that would prevent women from becoming ordained priests. So I think within the context of talking about Dorothy, we have to bring up some of the roles and the ways in which we women still work with oppression within the church, with ways in which clericalism does still have a momentum in how we view ourselves. And so to welcome young women at Holy Cross and any college and any university, we have to welcome that was in Dorothy Day, perhaps never spoken, but I believe in my deep Catholic feminist heart probably was there in some context, waiting to emerge even in her 90s. So on behalf of all the women of Holy Cross and all the women who are part of this effort for canonization, and knowing Martha Hennessy very well, we women in the Catholic worker movement really feel strongly church through clericalism, but in all the ways we know about war and rape as a vehicle of war and all the other contexts in which women are the sufferers of all the militarism. But this is the way I, as a woman, claim Dorothy Day as my saint.
Two quick questions for George. You said the archdiocesan phase would be wrapped up in 2 years. How long would it take to wrap up the Roman phase? And then secondly, is there a requirement for multiple miracles of the canonization process? And if so, could you answer?
Sean, I say 2 years because there's a little plotting that'll take place. By the time we get the censors, each one of her writings has to be read by 2 theological censors. The historians, we don't have to have a number of them do each writing, but it's probably going to take 2 years. In terms of the Roman phase, I'm afraid I don't know very much about that. My understanding is that we need a miracle for beatification. One of the things that the Guild does is take prayer requests. Theoretically, she's not at a stage where we can pray for her intercession. It's a little bit of a catch-22, right? Because people are praying to her. And so they send us the prayer requests. We keep a record. Some of that may have impact. But I believe, and there seems to be some thinking among the people in the diocese that if we can get the local phase done, because when the Pope was here and spoke before Congress and came to New York, she was at the top of his attention, and there was some question raised: how far along is the process? And if we were further along in the local phase, who knows? But I think if we get that done, then we'll have pretty smooth sailing in Rome. I also think with the Pope's concern about the cost, that's going to change things too. Again, I think we need to hurry. Does that answer, Sean, your question?
Lawler?
Mr. Ellsberg, you gave the title to your edition of the diaries, the title "The Duty of Delight,"
Yes.
which apparently was one of Dorothy's favorite sayings. I looked it up and she gave the reference to an English writer. But I was wondering if you could say, what did that mean to Dorothy? And also, what did it mean to you? Because for me, I don't know Dorothy very well. I found that just a tremendously meaningful idea. And just would like to hear what you thought about it.
Dorothy Day first used that term in the postscript for her autobiography, The Long Loneliness. She says, it's sometimes hard to remember the duty of delight. She doesn't attribute it there. So I came across that in her diaries, where she had come across this line from John Ruskin. And it became one of these little shorthand, almost mantras, that she would invoke at different times. Sometimes she would refer to it again. At one point, she even said, I've come up with, that's going to be the title for my next book. It's going to be The Duty of Delight. And I was very glad that she hadn't used it. The book that became Loaves and Fishes was going to be The Duty of Delight. Apparently, the publisher didn't want that. It would come, sometimes she'd list all these things that had happened during the day, and then she would just say, the duty of delight at the end. She didn't have to explain it to herself. She knew what it meant. For her, it meant, I think, that delight, like love, is a matter of discipline. It's a matter of will. It's a matter of a decision. It's easy to be delighted when things are delightful. But to remember delight, to remember to be grateful, to remember to find God in all things, even the things that are hard, even the things that are onerous, the things that wear you down. It was the same thing as one of the very key themes in her spirituality was that idea where there's no love, put love, and you will find love. It's one thing to love people who are lovable, but she said she believed that if you could make a conscious decision, this person is anything but lovable on their own natural terms. But if I make the decision to love them, a kind of magic will happen. Eventually, I'll be able to kind of see the image of God in them, despite all that deforms that image. So I think it was a very, very central theme for her. And the funny thing is that toward the end of her life, there was certain kind of formula like that she liked to repeat all the time. And you see, even in the very last pages of her diary, saying something like, the duty of delight. Where did that phrase come from again? You know, couldn't even remember where it came from, but it was one thing that she'd kind of pinned to her heart. What does it mean for me? I think that it was reading those diaries that made me really understand the heart of Dorothy Day. It was easy when I was a young person to think, these are the real Christians. They're out there picketing. They're out there getting arrested and going to jail and fasting and all that kind of stuff, getting beaten and whatever. And I think that, it was, but I burned out pretty fast. Some of these people have been here for 30 years. You notice I didn't stay there. It was not my vocation to remain a Catholic worker. But reading her diaries was, it was more than just understanding, okay, she was a Catholic, that was the foundation of her vocation. But to understand the kind of key to her spirituality, which was that, came very much through Therese and the Little Flower, that idea that these are decisions that you make. These are choices that I'm going to make every day. I'm going to make a choice to be more loving. I'm going to make a choice to be more forgiving. Not just because Dorothy was just naturally like that. Somebody once told her, hold your temper, Dorothy. And she said, I hold more temper in 1 minute than you will in your entire lifetime. She could be kind of cussed. She could be sarcastic. She could hold a grudge, believe me. Something that Thomas Merton did that bugged her, and 30 years later, if you'd mention Thomas Merton, she'd say, I remember the time he did it. I said, well, Dorothy, didn't he apologize for that? Well, if he did, I don't remember that, she said. She could be judgmental. She could write really harsh things. There's a letter, this is not going to disqualify her from canonization, but it might take her out of running for Mother of the Year. There's some of the letters to her daughter, Tamar, all the way to heaven, where you see Dorothy, just like any other human parent, struggling between, this tension between trying to, your kids have to be free, but you want to kind of, best for them and that sort of thing. And a letter where she just lays into Tamar. And I was thinking, oh my God, Now I could have said, well, that's a letter I could lose, but I thought it shows her humanity. It shows she was a real human being. She was not this Blessed de Montfort weeping over his food or something like that. She was a person who got angry, who lost her temper. But what makes a saint is somebody, not that they have no human failings, not that they ever fail or have a weakness or sins, but that they reflect on that, and they try to incorporate the lessons. They try to amend their behavior, their hearts. They examine their conscience. And that was what was so striking to me in reading Dorothy's diaries, that's what made her a saint, not the fact that she went to jail and that sort of thing. The fact that she lived her life on a day-by-day, hour-by-hour in the presence of God. And that was deeply moving to me.
The journals are very much worth reading. They're just a wonderful, wonderful introduction and sense of her life. We talked today about the Catholic worker in Worcester. One of my favorite letters she wrote to Mary Paulson when Mary Paulson's daughter was living as the Catholic worker in New York, and the Catholic worker people in New York were young people not behaving properly at all. And she just let it all out. But these people down here, they don't understand anything about love, and much less sex. It was great. It was great. Let me just say that Robert was kind enough to quote my statement about Dorothy. At the end of that essay, it was published when she died, I said that one of the things would be to kind of imagine Dorothy at the center of the church, not at the fringe of the church. And talk about gratitude to the Holy Spirit in a very real sense. When you read the joy of the gospel, when you listen to Pope Francis, when you heard him say that in Congress, you say, yes, yes, yes. What will the church look like when Dorothy is at the center and the rest of us are trying to get there as we can?
David called it, 1980.
Thank you.